If you've ever worked under someone who didn't need to raise their voice to make a room tense, you already know the type. Karen wasn't loud. She didn't slam doors or throw tantrums. She didn't need to. Her control was quieter than that. Surgical, almost. She moved through the office with a calm that suggested everything was already decided before anyone else had spoken. When she walked into a meeting, conversation softened. People straightened in their chairs without realizing they were doing it. There was an unspoken understanding that you measured your words around her because she measured everything you said back to you. Her desk was always immaculate. A single notebook, a pen, a closed laptop, and a small stack of reports lined up like exhibits in a courtroom. Behind her, the window framed the Boston skyline like a backdrop she had personally arranged. And on the corner of that desk sat the object that came to define our working relationship, a red felt-tip pen. Not a regular ballpoint. A thick, permanent, impossible-to-ignore red pen. She used it like a scalpel. Reviews with Karen weren't conversations. They were performances. She had a habit of reading silently for the first minute, just long enough to make you uncomfortable, before uncapping that pen with a small, deliberate click. The first circle would land somewhere unpredictable, a comma, a heading, a phrase. Then she'd look up briefly, almost amused, before continuing to dismantle the page in front of you. She rarely commented on the actual analysis. She focused on tone, structure, phrasing, spacing, the kind of details that felt impossible to argue against because they were always just preferences. Her tone was the worst part. She never insulted you outright. She insulted the work in a way that implied something about you. "This reads like a first draft," she would say. Or, "Did you proofread this?" Or, "Did you just send it?" Statements designed to land soft but sit heavy. The kind of comments that don't hurt in the moment but replay in your head later that night. Have you ever worked for someone who corrects things that don't actually need correcting? Someone who isn't fixing the work, they're fixing your posture? That was Karen. She wasn't building better employees. She was building obedient ones. And the strangest part was, for the first few weeks, I genuinely believed I was the problem. I thought maybe I just needed to sharpen up, study her preferences, anticipate her edits. I told myself she was tough but fair. I was wrong about the second part. It wasn't just me. That took a little time to notice. At first, I assumed my experience was personal, that maybe I was still adjusting and everyone else had already figured out how to navigate Karen's standards. But when you sit in the same room long enough, patterns reveal themselves. During team meetings, I began to notice how quickly people deferred to her. Not respectfully, cautiously. There's a difference. When someone presented an update, they spoke in clipped sentences, as if minimizing risk by minimizing words. No one elaborated unless directly asked. Questions were framed carefully, almost defensively. If Karen circled something in red during a group review, the air shifted. You could see shoulders stiffen. No one wanted their document projected on the screen longer than necessary. And what struck me most was that her criticism was rarely consistent. One week she would insist on brevity. The next week she'd accuse someone of lacking detail. She moved the goalposts subtly, just enough to keep everyone off balance. The strangest part wasn't that she corrected people. Good managers do that. It was that no one ever pushed back. Not once did I see someone say, "That's what you asked for last week." It was as if challenging her memory, or her authority, was considered more dangerous than being wrong. Have you ever been in an environment where competence isn't the currency, compliance is? Where it feels safer to be invisible than excellent? That was the atmosphere settling over our small team. And slowly, I realized something uncomfortable. If this pattern continued, it wouldn't just erode morale. It would erode confidence. Mine included. The assignment that consumed most of my time was a weekly exposure report tied to oil warrants in Nigeria. It sounds abstract if you're not in finance, but the implications were real. A warrant, in simple terms, gives someone the right to buy something at a predetermined price. In this case, the right to purchase oil at a price significantly lower than where the market had moved. If exercised at the wrong time, or without us properly tracking it, the losses could have been substantial. It wasn't theoretical risk. It was the kind of oversight that could trigger uncomfortable executive conversations very quickly. So the numbers mattered. Accuracy mattered. Timing mattered. I treated that report seriously. Every data point was verified. Every exposure calculation double-checked. I wasn't careless. If anything, I leaned toward over-preparing. I understood the stakes, and I wasn't interested in being the analyst whose mistake showed up in a senior review. Karen never criticized the numbers. That's important. Not once did she accuse me of miscalculating risk or misunderstanding the financial structure. Instead, she attacked how I presented it. The way I introduced the exposure summary, the order of sections, the phrasing of commentary. If I wrote, "There is a potential liability exposure," she might circle it and say, "Too passive." If I changed it to, "We are exposed to potential liability," she might underline it and say, "Alarmist tone." The target kept moving. After a while, you start to question whether the issue is precision or preference. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If the substance of the work is solid, but the presentation is endlessly flawed, it stops feeling like coaching. It starts feeling like control. Have you ever been told your work is wrong, even when you know it isn't? Not factually wrong, stylistically wrong, perpetually wrong, conveniently wrong? That's where this began to shift for me. Because I wasn't making errors. I was stepping into a pattern, and that pattern was becoming predictable. By the third month, the weekly routine had become almost scripted. I would submit the report Thursday afternoon, confident in the numbers and cautiously optimistic about the formatting. Karen would call me into her office Friday morning. She would skim silently, uncap the red pen, and begin the ritual. The first few circles were almost random, a sentence transition here, a heading alignment there. Then the commentary would follow. This structure doesn't flow. You buried the lead. Why is this paragraph here? The critiques were rarely consistent with the previous week's feedback. I started keeping mental notes. If she told me to tighten the executive summary, I tightened it. If she said the risk explanation needed more context, I expanded it. The following week, she would circle the expanded section and say it was too verbose. If I condensed it again, she'd accuse me of lacking detail. It felt less like refinement and more like shifting standards. And here's the part that took time to admit. I began adjusting not to improve the report, but to predict her reaction. That's a subtle but important difference. When you focus more on anticipating criticism than delivering clarity, something has already gone sideways. I wasn't thinking about the executive audience anymore. I was thinking about the red pen. One Friday, after she had marked nearly every page, I walked back to my desk and laid the report flat in front of me. It looked like it had been through a small war. Lines, arrows, circled phrases. I remember staring at it and thinking, if someone else reviewed this objectively, would they actually see flaws or just preferences? That question lingered. Have you ever reached a point where no matter what you do, the outcome feels predetermined? Where the feedback doesn't evolve? It just relocates. That's when frustration starts to harden into something else. Not anger yet. Clarity. Because patterns, when repeated enough times, stop feeling accidental. And once I started seeing the pattern clearly, I realized something that shifted everything. The issue wasn't that the reports were bad. The issue was that control required them to be imperfect. And once you recognize that, you stop trying to win approval and start observing behavior. There's a moment in every unhealthy dynamic when confusion gives way to recognition. For me, it happened quietly. Not during a confrontation, not during one of her critiques, but at my desk on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. I had just implemented every single correction she gave me the week before. I had tightened language, reorganized sections, adjusted formatting to match her stated preferences. I submitted the report almost experimentally, not with anxiety, but curiosity. Friday morning came, and the red pen ritual began again. Different circles, different complaints, same tone. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not emotionally, analytically. If feedback changes every week regardless of adjustments, it isn't feedback. It's leverage. I replayed the past few months in my head and saw the pattern clearly. The criticism wasn't designed to elevate the work. It was designed to reinforce authority. As long as something was wrong, she remained necessary. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The insecurity I had felt early on began to dissolve. Not because the environment improved, but because I understood it. When someone critiques for control, improvement doesn't protect you. Obedience does. And I wasn't interested in becoming obedient. Have you ever realized that the standard keeps changing because the goal isn't excellence, it's dependence? That realization is uncomfortable, but it's also freeing. Because once I stopped trying to meet a moving target, I started paying attention to something else entirely. Patterns leave trails. And sometimes those trails lead somewhere interesting. The discovery happened on a Tuesday evening when most of the office had already emptied out. The lights above the main floor had dimmed slightly, and the usual hum of conversation was replaced by the low mechanical buzz of the HVAC system. I wasn't hunting for anything dramatic. I was looking for archived data tied to an older exposure case that might have relevant precedent for our current report. The network drive was cluttered, layered with folders labeled by year, quarter, and project code. It took patience to navigate. That's when I saw her name. A folder from several years back, time-stamped before she had a team reporting to her. I hesitated for a second, not out of caution, but curiosity. If she had once handled similar work herself, I wanted to see how she structured it. Maybe there was something useful there. Maybe it would finally explain what she actually wanted. I opened the first file. The formatting looked familiar immediately. Same executive summary header style. Same bullet structure for risk commentary. Same spacing choices between sections. I scrolled further. The tone of the introductory paragraph mirrored the phrasing she had criticized in my own report just days earlier. Even the way she framed potential liability exposure, the sentence rhythm, the qualifiers, matched what she had circled in red and labeled as weak. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen longer than I meant to. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe she had evolved her preferences over time. I opened another document from the folder. Same structure. Same sequencing of data presentation. Same language patterns. The more files I opened, the more the pattern solidified. The very elements she had repeatedly attacked in my reports had once been her own default. I pulled up one of my recent submissions and placed it side by side with her archived report. The resemblance wasn't subtle. If someone removed the dates and numbers, you'd struggle to tell them apart. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity and a quiet, unexpected sense of opportunity. Have you ever stumbled across something that shifts the entire balance of a situation? Not by exposing wrongdoing, but by exposing inconsistency? I wasn't looking for leverage, but leverage had just presented itself. I downloaded the folder. Not because I planned to confront her immediately. Not because I wanted to embarrass her. But because documentation has a way of changing conversations. And for the first time in months, I felt like the conversation might finally shift in a direction I could control. I didn't act on it immediately. That's important. For a brief moment, I considered ignoring what I had found. It would have been easier to close the folder, log off, and continue playing the weekly game of red ink and shifting standards. Confrontation carries risk in corporate environments, especially when hierarchy is involved. And while Karen's behavior frustrated me, I wasn't reckless. I understood politics. I understood perception. But I also understood documentation. I went back through the archived files carefully. I downloaded multiple versions, not just one. Cover letters, executive summaries, formatted reports. I compared timestamps. I made sure nothing could be dismissed as coincidence. If I was going to act, it wouldn't be impulsive. It would be precise. Then I asked myself a simple question. What happens if I change nothing about my performance, but change the framework? The next weekly report was due in a few days. I could have continued tweaking phrasing to chase her moving preferences. Instead, I made a different choice. I would use her own blueprint, structure, tone, formatting, and see what happened. Not to embarrass her, not to win an argument, but to test a hypothesis. If the criticism continued, then it would confirm what I already suspected. It was never about the work. Have you ever reached a point where you stop defending yourself and start observing the system instead? That's where I was.
Calm.
Curious. Almost detached. The frustration had burned off. What remained was strategy. And strategy is quieter than anger. I saved the files locally, closed the network drive, and went home that night with something I hadn't felt in months. Leverage. The following week, I approached the report differently. Not emotionally, methodically. I pulled up Karen's archive template on one screen and my draft on another. I didn't skim. I replicated. Section headers were aligned exactly as she had formatted them years earlier. Paragraph spacing mirrored her structure. Even the phrasing of transitional sentences, the way she moved from exposure summary into forward-looking commentary, was intentionally modeled after her own writing. I kept the data current, the figures accurate, the risk calculations precise. But the skeleton of the document was hers. The process felt strangely calm. There was no adrenaline, no petty satisfaction. It was more clinical than that. I wasn't sabotaging the work. I was preserving it. If anything, I was ensuring it met a standard she herself had once endorsed. I reviewed it twice before printing, not for stylistic perfection, but for integrity. If she criticized it, the flaw would not be in the numbers. It would not be in the logic. It would exist somewhere else. I remember looking at the final document before walking it down the hallway. It didn't look dramatically different from previous weeks. That was the point. It wasn't a trap. It was a mirror. Have you ever prepared for a conversation knowing you weren't going to argue? Just present evidence? That's what this felt like. Controlled. Quiet. Almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. There was no need for dramatic buildup. The stage had already been set over months of repetition. All that remained was to let the pattern play out one more time. I knocked on her office door and stepped inside, report in hand. Karen didn't look up immediately when I entered. She was reviewing something on her screen, glasses resting low on her nose. I placed the report gently on the corner of her desk and stepped back. Weekly update, I said evenly. She nodded once without making eye contact, slid the laptop aside, and pulled the document toward her. The red pen appeared almost automatically in her hand. That small, familiar click echoed louder in my head than it probably should have. She began reading. The first page passed without comment. Not unusual. Sometimes she waited before striking. Her eyes moved steadily across the executive summary. I watched the subtle shift in her expression as she reached the second paragraph. There it was. The faint tightening around her mouth. The pen hovered, then descended. Circle. This introduction is too passive, she said, not looking at me. It lacks urgency. She underlined the next sentence twice. And this structure, why would you frame the exposure commentary here? It disrupts the flow. Her tone was measured but unmistakably critical. She flipped to the second page. Another circle. Another underline. Another comment about phrasing. The critique wasn't loud, but it was consistent, the same cadence I'd heard for months. She leaned forward slightly, absorbed in the ritual. This paragraph is redundant, she added. And the formatting here feels inconsistent. I didn't speak. I stood there with my hands loosely clasped behind my back, watching her dismantle a document she believed was mine. She continued for several minutes, moving page by page, occasionally glancing up just long enough to ensure I was absorbing the criticism. At one point, she shook her head subtly, as if disappointed in my inability to internalize past feedback. We've talked about this before, she said. You need to start thinking more strategically about how you present information. The irony almost made me smile. By the time she reached the final page, the red ink had spread generously across the margins. She set the pen down with a faint sigh and leaned back in her chair. This, she said, tapping the first page again, is probably the worst one you've submitted so far. There it was, the line that had anchored this entire pattern. For a brief second, the room was silent. The hum of the air conditioning filled the space between us. I nodded slowly, as if considering her words. Then I stepped forward and reached into the folder I had brought with me. Before I make revisions, I said calmly, there's something you should see. She looked at me for the first time with mild impatience. What is it? I placed a second stack of papers on her desk, aligned neatly beside the marked-up report. These are archived reports from a similar project a few years ago. I continued. I came across them while pulling reference data. She frowned slightly, but began flipping through them. The structure was identical. The formatting mirrored the document she had just criticized. The phrasing, the supposedly passive introduction, the sequencing of risk commentary, matched line for line. I watched her eyes move back and forth between the two stacks. The pen remained motionless in her hand. She scanned the headers again, then the paragraphs she had circled moments earlier. For the first time since I joined her team, she wasn't speaking. This template looked familiar. I added evenly. So I used it. The silence stretched. She turned to the first page of her archived report, and then back to mine. Her posture shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to register. The confidence that had filled the room minutes earlier thinned into something more cautious. She flipped another page, slower this time. "You're saying," she began, then stopped. "I used your formatting," I clarified, "from your previous work. I thought it would align more closely with your expectations." There was no accusation in my tone. No edge. Just fact. Her eyes moved across the red circles she had drawn on my report, then to the identical sentences in her own archived version. She didn't apologize. She didn't retract her earlier statement. She simply closed both stacks of paper and set the pen down. "Send it as is," she said quietly. I didn't move immediately. "Just to confirm," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "You mentioned less than a minute ago that it was the worst one yet." She avoided eye contact. "We don't have time to redo it." The authority in her voice had shifted. It was still firm, but less certain. I nodded once, gathered the report, and walked out of her office. The hallway felt different. Not louder, not brighter, just lighter. I returned to my desk and sent the report without making a single change. Have you ever watched someone realize they've contradicted themselves in real time? Not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet, unmistakable way. That's what happened in that office. There was no shouting, no escalation, just exposure. And exposure, when handled calmly, carries weight. That was the last time she used the phrase, "worst one yet." The change wasn't dramatic. There was no visible collapse, no sudden transformation in Karen's demeanor. The following week, she reviewed the report again, pen in hand, posture composed. But something subtle had shifted. The red circles were fewer, the commentary shorter. Where she might once have paused to emphasize a minor phrasing issue, she now skimmed more carefully before marking anything at all. It wasn't generosity. It was caution. In meetings, her tone remained controlled, but the edge had softened slightly. She still corrected, still guided, still positioned herself as the authority in the room. But the certainty with which she dismantled work had diminished. It was as if a small crack had appeared in the foundation of her ritual, and she was careful not to press on it too hard. We never spoke directly about that day again. There was no acknowledgement, no apology, no admission. Corporate environments rarely provide those kinds of clean endings. But the balance of power had adjusted. Not dramatically, just enough. Have you ever noticed how exposing a pattern once is sometimes enough to change it? Not because the person becomes better, but because they become aware that they're being observed. That awareness introduces restraint. Karen still carried her red pen. She still reviewed reports meticulously. But the blind confidence with which she labeled work incompetent had been replaced by something more measured. And that quiet recalibration told me everything I needed to know. It was never about perfection. It was about control. And control doesn't thrive under scrutiny. Over the next few months, the rhythm between us changed. Karen still reviewed my reports, but the theatrical dismantling never fully returned. She would mark a line here or there, adjust phrasing occasionally, but the sweeping declarations, "worst one yet, did you even read this?" disappeared. It wasn't that she trusted my work more. It was that she knew I had context. I continued saving archived templates quietly. Not out of paranoia, but preparation. Documentation had proven useful once. There was no reason to abandon the habit. I didn't flaunt it. I didn't hint at it. I simply worked. If she suggested structural changes one week, I implemented them thoughtfully. If she contradicted herself the next week, I noted it. The difference now was internal. I no longer questioned my competence. I evaluated her consistency. Have you ever experienced that shift? When someone's authority over you stops feeling absolute and starts feeling conditional. It's subtle, but it changes how you carry yourself. I spoke more evenly in meetings. I stopped over-explaining my reasoning. I answered questions directly instead of defensively. The anxiety that once accompanied her reviews faded into something steadier. Karen never mentioned the archived reports again. She didn't need to. We both understood what had happened. The dynamic wasn't friendly, but it was balanced. And sometimes balance is all you need. A few months later, I found another opportunity and resigned. There was no dramatic exit speech. No confrontation. Just a formal notice and a handshake. The red pen stayed on her desk. I walked out with something better. Perspective. When I handed in my notice, Karen nodded with the same measured composure she had always carried. She asked where I was going, offered a brief comment about career progression, and wished me well in a tone that was professionally neutral. There was no reference to the months prior, no revisiting of that afternoon in her office. Corporate life rarely revisits uncomfortable truths. It simply absorbs them and moves forward. On my last day, I packed my desk into a small cardboard box, a few notebooks, a coffee mug, some printed reports I'd kept for reference. As I passed her office, I noticed the red pen still resting in its usual spot. It looked less intimidating than it once had. Not because it had changed, but because I had. Have you ever realized that the real win in a situation isn't humiliating someone, it's understanding them? I didn't expose Karen to upper management. I didn't escalate the moment beyond that room. I simply handed her a mirror and let her see what she had been insisting didn't exist. That was enough. The job didn't turn out to be the career-launching experience I had imagined in my mid-20s. But it taught me something more durable than prestige. It taught me that when criticism becomes ritual, documentation becomes power. And sometimes the most effective response isn't louder effort, it's quiet evidence. I didn't leave angry. I left informed. And that made all the difference.